Good evening and welcome to our series. We're looking at episode 4 today, North-South Standoff. We're looking at chapter 11 of the book of Daniel, which is the longest chapter, by the way, in the book of Daniel. Some 45 verses. It's got a dense prophetic timeline filled with intricate political movements. Many interpreters get bogged down in historical minutiae, especially around Antiochus Epiphanes. Then they leap to a future Antichrist. What's the principle of interpretation that should guide us here? How do we avoid the ditch of historic confusion and the ditch of speculative futurism?
And to answer that, I would say we need to look at the big picture. Not get bogged down in those small brush strokes, but keep in mind the big picture.
Excellent.
And big picture is the war. Daniel chapter 9 has this statement: to the end there will be war. And that's an important statement, because whatever comes after this, to the end of Daniel's vision, is about the war. Now I'm going to illustrate how translations obscure the meaning. For example, when we go to chapter 10, verse 1, in Hebrew, it literally, Tzava Gadol, the great war, right there. The message is about great war. But when I look in this New King James translation, there's no great war. It says, the appointed time was long. There's no appointed time at all, because the Hebrew term moed for appointed time is not present in this verse. This is about great war. So from verse 26 of chapter 9, that introduces the great war to the end, the rest, the 3 chapters, are focusing on this war. And the war is not just any war, it's a spiritual war. Notice chapter 10 begins in the 3rd year of Cyrus. So again, this is a specific historical date that is given. And so the space in time between chapters 9 and 10 is 2 years. So again, God reveals something and he doesn't follow up the next week or the next month. Another 2 years go by until Daniel sees vision. And notice what Daniel is doing. He's fasting and praying. For 3 weeks, he's fasting and praying. And I'm saying this because it's important for us to understand that if we need an answer from God, fast and pray until God answers. It's that important. And in this chapter 10, I'm not going to get in too many details, but interesting things happen here.
Now, this is Michael then.
That's right.
Okay, so this is the first time in the chapter that Michael is mentioned. Who exactly is Michael? Is he just another angelic being, or is there more to his identity, especially in connection to Daniel 12 and Revelation 12?
So in verse 13, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. So all this time Daniel is praying. There's a spiritual battle in the background. The mighty angel that is about to speak to Daniel is basically saying, listen, Prince of Persia. Now that's not literal Cyrus, Prince of Persia. We're talking Cyrus here as a symbol of greater spiritual warfare, right? Until Michael, the chief prince. Some focus on one of and think there's more than one. And we'll talk about that tomorrow night when we zoom in on chapter 12, right? And so later on, the chapter ends with verse 20, again stating Michael's presence. So I'm going to leave answer about who Michael is until tomorrow night. I'm just going to give a little reveal here. That in Hebrew, Mikael is a compound word that is actually 3 words in English. Mi is who, which could be a question. Ka is like, and El is God. Who is like God? Now, it is significant because if you go through all the biblical statements, no one is ever like God.
Correct.
There was one who wanted to be like God, and you know what happened to him, right? Lucifer.
Yeah.
So there's no one who could say, I am like God, but one. And this is where I believe that Michael is another name for who is Christ, pre-incarnate, eternal, you see. It's not just Jesus, son of Mary of Nazareth, but pre-incarnate Christ. And I'm putting some passages there because Bible is very clear that no one is ever to say that they are like God. For example, in Exodus, I'm just going to read this one passage from verse 9. Verse 11 says, "Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods?" And it's a rhetoric question with the answer, none.
Nobody.
And so when you have someone who is like God, it is that visible representation of the invisible God. And you rightly mentioned Revelation 12, because in Revelation 12, when the war in heaven is described, it's the war between Michael and his angels and Satan, dragon, the serpent, and his angels.
Yes.
So the one who leads God's armies, well, that's a question for everyone. Who do you think leads God's army? God himself,
right.
you see? And so in Daniel 10, he ends here with an interesting point. I'm going to read this again from verse 20. Then he says, "Do you know why I have come to you? Now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. No one upholds me against these except Michael, your prince." And so it's a reveal, a window in what's really happening. Whenever there's a war on earth, there's a greater war happening that is unseen, behind the scenes. So again, you see Persia and Greece mentioned, but the bigger war that is happening is the one where Michael, the chief of God's army, is fighting Satan.
That's from the beginning to the end, isn't it? It's
end,
always
that's right.
that controversy between good, quote unquote, and evil.
That's
Good.
right. And if we see that, then even the wars, the First World War, the Second World War, the war in Ukraine right now, these wars have deeper spiritual cause behind them. And God not just permits, he's actively involved in reshaping the world according to his purpose, bringing it all to his end.
And I guess that's why we have to decide who we're going to trust.
Right.
Are we going to trust man's power and all their wars and all the power they believe they have, or what God says he has, that he's in control?
That's
of it
right.
all?
So I hope we set up enough picture to move in chapter 11, okay?
Okay.
And so chapter 11 begins, by the way, there in the 4th year of Darius the Mede, even I. That's not Daniel who's standing to support. It's again angelic beings supporting the kings in doing God's will.
Yes.
And so we have introduction to the kings of Persia. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. And Persia is a great empire. Persepolis, the ruins are still standing. Food is great. I've been to Atlanta restaurant called Persepolis, and I tell you, they know how to cook. But the focus here is on these kings, and it's interesting how Hebrew uses frame. 3 more kings arise, and the 4th. They could have said 4 kings arise, but it's 3 more kings, and most scholars agree that these are the kings, Cambyses, Darius, and Xerxes, because they've impacted the development of the empire the most. Some disagree if the 4th is Xerxes or the 4th is Artaxerxes. The fame of Artaxerxes the first is that it's in his turn that the command went forth to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Okay. That's why I believe that he is mentioned, because he's connected to the prophecy, you see. And so 4 are mentioned.
4, but we know there are a lot more kings than that, up to what, some 13.
You're right.
So why only 4 mentioned? Is there some symbolic reason and or a prophetic reason for omitting those others?
Because chapter 11 is not a history lesson.
Okay.
This is not ancient history textbook where we're going to examine and scrutinize every king.
Got you.
Vision just zooms in to say, okay, we're dealing with Persia. Persia's going to be out of the way. And now we're jumping to the next. We're jumping to Greece. That's reality in this chapter.
So it's almost like prophecy simplifies things so we can get the significance that's spiritual.
And that's why even for our audience, if you think that we're going to get in all the nitty-gritty today of the names and funny names of those Syrian kings, we're not. We're going to look at the big picture of this spiritual war that is happening. And just remember, as in Daniel 8, the Medo-Persia, the ram, is encountering the goat. So right here, we have immediately the Greece coming on the stage. And so, mighty king of Greece that will rule with great dominion and do his will, but then, notice, when he's arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds. Just as we study in Daniel chapter 8 before. After death of Alexander the Great, empire falls apart, and there's four major territories that are arranged between his generals. So there's Seleucus, Ptolemy, and the history is fascinating. For example, Ptolemy would be the first to assert his territory and establish himself. He would not declare himself emperor or ruler or king until 305, but he would be already ruling in 320. Seleucus would get in trouble under Antigonus and run to Ptolemy. He would actually serve as his admiral, navy admiral. So Seleucus would serve Ptolemy for a time, and then Ptolemy would give him army, 1,000 men to go and establish himself and take over Babylonia. So there's a lot of interesting details. But the bottom line is these four that we focus, again, are not in focus. Because right after this, we're moving to what? Verse 5.
Okay.
Kings of North and South.
Sure.
And so just to bring to attention those who are watching us maybe for the first time, we covered in the previous nights Daniel 2, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and divided kingdoms. And then Daniel chapter 7, the beasts. And then we'll look with you at Daniel chapter 8, which starts with Persia, Greece, and then the little horn that covers that period of Rome as terrible beast and the horns. And so now in chapter 11, we see again Persia is touched. There's four Persian kings mentioned. Alexander and four Greek kingdoms are mentioned. But after this, immediately we're jumping to this kings of north and king of south.
Wait a minute. So essentially, it seems odd, I guess, that it was split into 4 divisions.
Right.
But now we go to just 2. Is there a significance for that? I mean, what happened to the other 2?
Very good question. It's not that they stopped existing. They continued in Macedonia and north of contemporary day Turkey. But if you look at this map, Jerusalem is central to 2 kingdoms that would always fight for this territory. Ptolemy from the south, he was king of Egypt, and then Seleucus from the north. And when they're marching, because of the Arabian desert, they do not come from the east. They have to go north and then come down from the north. And so the focus is on these 2 kingdoms always fighting over the people of God and the city of God. And so they will become a symbol for that greater war, for that spiritual warfare that is taking place. And that's what's happening here. Now, it is tempting to go into this soap opera of Syria, Egypt, all right? For example, I'll give you an example. Daniel 11, verse 6 tells a story of daughter of the south king will go to the north king to make a treaty. She shall not retain the strength. She shall be given up, her attendants, her begetter, and her supporter. And so many commentators, by the way, if you go on the YouTube and just type Daniel 11, scores and scores of interpretations. It seems every denomination out there has their own version. Most actually get bogged down in details of Syrian and Egyptian kings. And so they talk about this Antiochus and marriage with Berenice, who was daughter of Ptolemy. They wanted to make a pact, but then Ptolemy dies. Antiochus decides, why do I need this? So he brings his former wife, which he divorced to marry Berenice, okay? She doesn't trust her husband, so she poisons him, kills Berenice and her son, which is threat to her throne, right? And so there's a lot of drama there. If you zoom in on a few other verses, for example, Daniel 11:17, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom to make a proposal. He shall give him a daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or be for him. And you realize it's hard to understand. He, both north and south are he. So There's a scholar, Tarsi Lee from Oakwood University, and he's done very interesting study. I watched a symposium where he color codes all the he's and goes from Hebrew to sort it out. But the funny thing is this daughter of woman, you cannot talk about the history of Egypt without mentioning, you want to guess who? Cleopatra.
Okay, that's the daughter of woman. Okay.
Cleopatra. And the funny thing is when you read the history, Cleopatra was always plotting and scheming. There was never a faithfulness. One Cleopatra married her brother. And there's a lot of political intrigues. And of course, they want to talk about Cleopatra. Is it really about Cleopatra? Because when you look at these studies, it's funny because you mentioned before, Daniel is the longest chapter, 45 verses. So in the first 4 verses, we cover Persia and Greece, almost 300 years. And then we're going to get bogged down for the rest of the chapter in 200 years of Egypt-Syria drama. It makes no sense. That's why when you look at this chapter, you have to understand there is a historical balance that should be considered. I'll give you one more example why I don't think that is a right approach to interpretation, okay? Verse 21, in his place shall arise a vile person to whom they will not give the honor or royalty, but he shall come in time of peace and seize the kingdom by intrigue, right? So they talk now about Antiochus Epiphanes. See, everybody comes to this Antiochus Epiphanes. Yesterday, as I drove to Sarnia and back, I've been watching few more videos, and they all talk about Antiochus Epiphanes. And then they come to details that they cannot explain, and that's what they do. They say, oh, that's about the future Antichrist that is to come. So everything in Daniel 11 comes to Antiochus Epiphanes, and then there's a gap until future Antichrist comes. And I'm saying it makes no sense. And here's my final example why I don't want to talk about this. With the force of a flood, that's the same guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Armies shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. But notice Antiochus Epiphanes is long before Jesus. So they say, oh, this prince of the covenant is the priest, high priest Onias III. Really? Does anyone even know who Onias III is? Okay. And so that's why all these attempts to put Antiochus Epiphanes as the central point of Daniel 11, to me, is the wrong direction. It's a wild goose chase. It's heading in a wrong direction, wrong track.
I mean, if you can't find an answer, let's create one. I guess that's what many people try to do, instead of searching the whole Bible to find what it's saying.
And I tell you, they've studied history in such details that if you dig enough, you could find some details to fit, okay? And there's a lot of interesting things. For example, Seleucids, they had access to India. That's Mesopotamia all the way to India. And there are certain creatures, magnificent creatures in India, big elephants. Ptolemy is in Africa, Egypt, and there's elephants there. So imagine these battles where on both sides they had these armored tanks, the Indian elephants versus African elephants, okay? That would be something to watch, something to see. So I tell you, a lot of commentators, they get into descriptions of these wars between Ptolemies and Seleucids. But I think personally, to get stuck there, we're going to miss the point what this chapter is all about.
Nice.
So, back to this chapter. Notice, kings of north and south are parallel to the little horn. So I believe that the timeline of these kings of north and south should correspond to the timeline from beginning of Roman power. It's not about those 4 Greek kingdoms, but it's about Roman power and all the way to the end. That's what I believe. Because verse 40 of chapter 11 has very specific theological term, at the time of the end. That et kets. And that will be repeated in chapter 12, the time of the end. And that is a theological formula that tells you it's not about Antiochus Epiphanes. It is something that will go all the way to the end.
So from verses 5 to 40, for example, names of the kings or nations drop out.
That's
now
right.
we just have the king of the north, king of the south.
That's right.
What's going on? Is this a clue that the focus is moving away from a literal geopolitical experience to something more symbolic?
Another excellent question. And you're right, there's no more Persia or Greece or even names of anybody. It's he. And you have to figure out if he is north or south.
Okay.
And this is what's happening there. In Hebrew, the word for north is Tzafon. And it means two things. There's a Mount Tzafon, and the term up is also Tzafon. So north is always up. And in their understanding, that's where God dwells. God is way up there, okay? In fact, in Isaiah, when that Lucifer says in his heart, I will go where? Up. I will go up. He's going to Tzafon. He's going to the north. He wants to usurp the place of God. And it's interesting that Babylon, that comes from the north, also has this suggestion. I am the religion. As confusing as it is, they offer a religion. The term Bab-el is the gates of God. And so Babylon is this, a substitute religion. It's a different narrative. It's an alternative view of who God is. And that's why I believe when we talk about north in this segment, we talk about a prototype of Babylon. Just keep that in mind.
Okay.
Yes, geopolitical Babylon, but more than that, it's a spiritual Babylon that is in view.
Because we look back at the Tower of Babel, that was the whole issue. They
That's
wanted
right.
to become gods, as it were, to get up there and prove what happened.
And so Babylon would always be a symbol of false religion. In fact, when you go to the book of Revelation, which we'll study later, Babylon becomes a symbol of false religion. But then we have Egypt. And probably a telling story is attitude of Pharaoh.
Okay.
When Moses comes and says, I came from God, and Pharaoh's reaction is, which God? I am God. Because see, in Egypt, Pharaoh was God. In Babylon, kings were not gods. They worshiped gods. They had a religion. They had high priests. But in Egypt, man, human being, the Pharaoh, was God.
Wow.
And so the birth of that humanism, birth of secularism, comes from Egypt. The word for Pharaoh literally means the big house, which is a synonym for the temple. And books are written explaining that. And so when you now contrast the north and south, north we're talking false religion, south we're talking humanistic atheism, you see. And that's something to keep in mind as we look further into this. And I know we're going to give a lot of information today, right, on this. So when I'm looking at this, it's interesting that there was an edict of toleration issued in Rome permitting Christianity to be a religion. Long before Constantine, it was in the year 311. Yes, there was still persecution of Christians who did not want to collaborate with the state, but there was an edict of toleration already granted. And significance of that is because many Christians were educated in the same schools as the pagan philosophers. One of the famous schools was Alexandrian school in Egypt. Again, you see, that secular influence school of philosophy. And for example, just two people I would mention, Origen, and he's known as the church father, right? Who introduced a lot of theology into Christianity, including immortality of the soul. Okay? Plotinus is the father of Neoplatonism. They're classmates. They're buddies who sat in college together, so to say. They're friends. They study from the same philosopher Ammonius.
Got you.
You see? And so right here, some interpreters look at this and say, could it be that the daughter of King of South is the secular philosophy that is coming to the King of North, to this religious Christian nation?
Interesting, yeah, because it seems at a certain point in Daniel 11, it moves from this kind of spiritual to just literal.
Right. Here's a statement from Tertullian. He says, heretics and philosophers propend the same themes and are caught up in the same discussions. What is the origin of evil and why, the origins of humans and how. And so they are entering into intellectual, logical dialogue. And with that comes peace. In fact, nephew of Constantine the Great, the Constantine, who legitimized Christianity completely and became Christian, although he was not baptized until his deathbed, his nephew would become the last pagan emperor, Julian the Apostate. He was a philosopher, and he wanted to restore the philosophical influence away from religion, you see. And so some try to interpret book of Daniel, chapter 11, through these allegoric, spiritualized terms. There's a lot of interesting details. For example, this Pope, Damasus, he takes on himself first title, Pontifex Maximus.
Great bridge builder.
And that was the title for Roman emperors. In fact, that means the chief priest of all high priests. Okay.
Well, these verses really seem to become like a fast-paced political drama, packed with betrayals, alliances, assassinations, and royal marriages. But at some point, this little history just does not match perfectly anymore. Could all these details serve as types or shadows of a deeper spiritual conflict?
Again, I'm so tempted to linger longer, and I appreciate you pushing me along with this, because this guy, Damasus, he would be first to claim Petrine succession, meaning Peter was the first pope, and we claim that laying on of hands of Petrine succession. He would be the first guy, you see? But my point is this: North and South are at peace in the Roman Christian church. What does it say about the dynamics within the church? If Egypt and Babylon kind of make pact within the Roman church. And so before I move on away from these historic details, for example, when they say, there's a new king of South coming, so they say, well, maybe these are the barbarians invading now the Christian Rome. But you're right. Let's move on. Here are inconsistencies. I'll give you a few examples. Some suggest that verse 20 is about Augustus, Emperor Augustus, because it's the one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom. And anyone who read the Gospels know that Luke chapter 2 tells us, I'm putting the years of his rule from minus 27 to plus 14. So Christ was born in his time.
Yes.
And he was the one who declared census through all the land. Guess what the census is for?
For taxation.
For taxes, for money. And so many say, well, verse 20 definitely is about Augustus. And then they follow that the next is the vile person, and say the vile person who takes the kingdom by intrigue, and he goes against the prince of the covenant must be Tiberius. Look at the dates of his reign. That's when Christ was crucified.
Yes.
So Christ was born under Augustus, crucified under Tiberius. And so many scholars believe that verses 20, 21, 22 are that era, beginning of the common era of history. I look at this and I see a problem. Here's my problem. This raiser of taxes, within a few days destroyed. That tells me he should have very short rule.
Sure.
Let's look at history. He is the longest reigning emperor. He's the one who establishes the empire. He lived to be 75 years, and he ruled 41 years.
And that's old for that day.
His full name is Octavian Julius Caesar Augustus, because he's adopted son of Julius Caesar. And his significance is known by everybody. You just don't pay attention. Guess when he died? I put it on the screen and we have to guess.
August 19.
August. Why do we call this month August?
Augustus.
In honor of Augustus. We have a lot of paganism in our calendars, in our daily vocabulary.
Sure.
So to me, it does not add up, because he did not live just a few days. He was the longest reigning. And that's why historical honesty denies some of these interpretations. I'm not going to give answers. I just want to paint the broad picture.
Sure.
For example, verse 31, shall pollute the sanctuary. Some translations say desecrate the temple fortress. And so you could imagine majority jump, oh, that's Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Some say, no, that's Romans in times of Jesus. And after Christ, they destroy the temple, right? Defile sanctuary temple, take away the daily sacrifice. So again, they want to bring both Antiochus Epiphanes and maybe Christ dying, place the abomination that makes desolate. And so when you look at this, yes, definitely Romans would take the menorah and would ransack the temple before burning it and destroying Jerusalem. Notice it cannot be Antiochus. Because when Jesus talks about the end time signs, he speaks of the future abomination of desolation. You see, cannot be the past, cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes. Could it be destruction of Jerusalem? Maybe. Maybe some of these prophecies have multiple applications. Maybe. But again, to bog down and to limit chapter 11 just to Syrians and Egyptians and maybe Jews is to miss the picture that this is big war that spans to the time of the end.
Well, I mean, if we look at every vision so far in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, 7, 8, and 9, they all seem to end to the end time.
That's
stretches
right.
to the end
That's
time.
right.
So shouldn't we expect Daniel 11 to follow that same tragedy?
Exactly.
Trajectory? Wow, I'm having fun
Exactly,
here.
and that's what I believe. Just like chapter 2 has the stone that crushes everything, right? Just as chapter 7 has the Ancient of Days seated on the throne, the same thing we should expect here. And I believe it because to me there's an evidence. Verses 27, 29, and 35 have these terms, and will come at appointed time. And here is that moed, a specific point in time. And prior to this, notice, Daniel is occupied with one question. When will this end? When will the sanctuary be cleansed? When will these things be over? And the answer was given. Wait, 2,300 days, years. And that's why I believe that Daniel 11 will run to the very end. Now, here's something that I've studied, and I believe that there are some details that suggest that there's a strong correlation between Daniel 11 and 8. For example, in verse 36, this king of the north, remember, false religion, he speaks blasphemy. Okay? The word there is very interesting. Okay? Niflaot, which means miracles and wonders. Who has the power to do miracles and wonders? God.
God, yeah.
So if anyone claims that they've got the power to do miracles and wonders, what are they doing? Blaspheming.
Okay.
Remember, Jesus got in trouble for what?
For doing miracles.
For
that's
doing
right.
miracles and wonders, and they call him out, say he blasphemes because he does miracles and wonders. But here, in Daniel 11, this king of the north, he does these niflaot, he does these miracles and wonders, and he does them not for, but against God of gods. And that is the same word where little horn in chapter 8, the one who has a fierce countenance. By the way, when you read chapter 8, first he sees a little horn, and then the explanation is given, and the little horn explanation here in verse 24 is given as the one who has a fierce countenance, you see. And
Destroy many men and saints.
when you look at this, that destruction of holy people is also done with niflaot in a miraculous, blasphemous way. Now, there's another sign that I believe these chapters are parallel, because in chapter 11, the king of the north exalts himself, magnifies himself, and prospers. Guess what little horn does? Exalts himself, magnifies himself, and prosper. And in Hebrew, these are the same words. Now, I don't want to bog down our audience with the little minutiae. I just want to put this on the record that there is a parallelism between chapters 11 and chapter 8. Now, this is probably the most significant. In chapter 8, verse 19, there is this time of the indignation. All right? Hazam, the time of indignation. Exactly same word is used in chapter 11, verse 36. And that's why I believe that here we start seeing more glimpses of what's really going on. In chapter 36, the king shall do accordingly to his own will. It's that authoritarian attitude. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemy against the God of gods, shall prosper until the wrath has been accomplished. You see, that time of indignation, that time of wrath that puts the limit to God's patience is mentioned in both Little Horn chapter 8 and the King of the North chapter 11.
Wow.
And that's why I believe that there's a plenty of literary evidence, scholarly evidence in Hebrew to point out that the King of the North in chapter 11 is the little horn.
Wow.
And that's why I'm making that assertion right now on the record. I believe that Daniel 11 is about the little horn as king. Okay? Something to reflect on,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so now, when you look at this chart again, then you understand that the kings of north and south are two variations of the little horn. It's an internal struggle within the little horn. Remember in chapter 8, we said that the little horn is pre-Constantine and post-Constantine. Notice what happens here, and I'm going to overlay right now with blue and red for north and south, just to make it easier for our audience. So Daniel 11 Kings is the church and state tension. You have Egypt representing the state power, Pharaoh who says, I'm God. And then you have Babylon church that claims that the ruler represents the will of God. And so these kings is the tension between church and state. It's a tension between false religion and secular philosophy within the same entity. So I believe, and I keep repeating this,
Yes, I hear.
that the king of north and king of south are not two separate entities. It's an internal struggle. In fact, probably the most significant verse of chapter 11 is verse 27. And I'm going to read it out loud. Both these kings' hearts are bent on evil. So is it fair to say that both north and south are evil? Their hearts bent on evil. There's no other way. They shall speak lies at what? The same table.
Yes.
These guys are sitting like you and I around the same table. We put our Bibles on it. These guys are sitting at the same table.
So it seems there that we're looking at a church-state union. There are some issues going on, of course, but they're not harmonious. I mean, they're sitting at the same table. They're lying to each other, i.e., it's like they're the same coin, but different sides of the same coin. That's what we see happening.
A preview in today's politics.
Okay, we'll go
This
on beyond
party, that party.
Yes.
Biblically speaking, God's people are not aligned with either or. Because we don't belong to earthly kingdoms.
Sure.
If we are people of God, we're neither with King of North nor King of South, we're with King of Kings.
And that will be the end as well, where
To
we
the
have to
very
make your
end.
choice. You're going to choose God or choose man.
To the very end. Because on earth, there's a constant tension. And for a person who is not seeing the big picture, they think, oh, this party will solve our problems.
Yeah.
Oh, this party will solve our problems. Reality is no. Satan is behind the scene doing their things. Just think of Christian history.
Yes.
The Crusades.
Yes.
They're Christian crusaders. And as they're charging there, they're killing other Christians because they think differently. The Western Crusaders would kill the Eastern Christians together with Muslims. In fact, the Christianity, as we know, has been split between the Western Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church. And when we talk sitting at the same table, they were sitting at the same table anathemizing each other.
Wow.
But there's something else going here. Some people ask me, so what is this abomination of desolation? How do you bring that into church? I said, well, any church that considers itself a temple on earth is abomination. That's a strong
Taking God's
statement.
place, essentially.
Exactly, because where's the temple? In heaven.
Yeah.
Any priest on earth who calls himself a priest intercessor is abomination. Because there's only one intercessor, one mediator, Jesus Christ.
Right. Or I'm the great bridge builder, which can take you from earth to heaven.
You bring up
Maximus.
Pontifex, right? So Pontifex is builder of bridges between spiritual and material realm, you see? And so that is the abomination. Trampling underfoot the sanctuary and its host is telling people that the priest and church on earth works out your salvation.
Wow. Wow.
Instead of understanding that no, Christ in heavenly places is guaranteeing our salvation. Now here's just an example. 1075, after the church split, Pope Gregory VII, he makes these statements. Pope is the only one whose feet are kissed by princes.
Okay.
Just gonna leave that to simmer for a moment, okay? Only Pope may depose emperors. Only Pope may be judged by no one, okay? The Roman Church never erred. See, it's this attitude that, in my opinion, represents that little horn character and the King of the North.
I mean, it almost seems like that person wants to become a world leader. And God says that will never happen again.
Exactly.
So no man will ever have that power again. But the abomination of desolation appears again also in verse 31. But Jesus refers to it in the future in the Matthew 24. If it wasn't fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes or the Roman destruction in 70 AD, then when and how is it ultimately fulfilled?
So I mentioned already, any churches that call themselves temples is the abomination. But as we look at the tension that is happening within this church-state union, I think you would see some worse abomination happening. Okay, let me show you an example.
Okay.
It's known historical fact that 14th century papacy was in so-called Avignon captivity. The popes were taken from Rome to France, and they had to reign from France, from Avignon. In fact, during this time, there was another plague, bubonic plague, and Avignon was hit the most in Europe. They had like 90% mortality, and that is the throne of papacy for 70 years. That's what they call it, Avignon captivity, just like Babylonian captivity, 70 years, Avignon captivity. So these popes are ruling from France. Guess what's happening in Rome? Have you heard of Renaissance? Supposed to be great thing happening, Renaissance. I don't know if there are any under 18 here, because we're going to show how the porn came to church.
Yes. Yeah.
You heard what I said?
Yes, I heard you.
Because they're bringing Greek mythology right into church. All those admirable, beautiful frescoes. Really? Think of the underlying theme. This is a Renaissance rebirth of carnal worship. There's no other way to put it. Okay? And as I said, welcome porn in church. All that stuff that was painted in churches, isn't that abomination?
Wow.
But there's a hope, because in the midst of this King of North struggle and tension comes verse 32. And it's a beautiful verse. The people who know their God shall be strong. Okay? In every generation, and notice, I'm not bashing a particular church.
Sure.
I'm just stating the history. You cannot go against the history. In every generation, in every century, there are people who knew their God, and they stood firm.
Yes.
During Antiochus Epiphanes, there was a family, and I mentioned them before, Maccabees. They stood strong, and they restored the temple, rededicated the temple, and gave a whole new feast to Jewish nation, Hanukkah. When you consider the Middle Ages, there are people like Waldenses.
Yes.
There are different groups all over Europe who are faithful to their God, and they're standing strong. We don't have time to describe all the persecutions. Next comes even more interesting verse. And those of the people who understand, or those who are wise, some translations say, they will instruct many, but for many days they will fall by sword and the flame. And so we know that within church comes reformation.
But why does it seem that Reformation efforts often ended up with more persecution than peace? Well, that seems so odd to me.
I wish we would have another hour to talk about
Okay, let's do that. No.
Even when humans try to fix things by our own way, nothing but trouble comes. When you look at the reformers, yes, they're great reformers, and they did bring some light back. We're going to look in more details when we go through the book of Revelation, because it's going to spill out more details of Reformation. But none of them were perfect. Martin Luther loved his beer. I doubt we would have him as a church elder today. Now, we're not here to look at their problems, but reality is that even within the Reformation group, they fought each other. One group of reformers persecuted others. Calvin reformers were persecuting Anabaptist believers, you see. And so verse 35 says, wise will fall, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. And that reminds me the opening of the fifth seal. When the souls under the altar in Revelation cry out, how long? And the voices said, wait for a little longer, you see. And so there are people who stood firm. And it's sad, because reformers persecuted other reformers. As much as we talk about how Catholic Church had Inquisition and burned reformers at the stakes, reformers did it to other reformers. So the history is an ugly history. And we should not whitewash some of it and ignore the other aspects. We need to look at the big picture. But this is what happens after Reformation. The King of the North, this church state, grows stronger. The Council of Trent only adds to the church power by decrees, and new orders are formed. One of those orders, and you could guess, emerges is the Jesuit order. And they go forth to set the world on fire. Now, they did it by secular means too. There's a lot of war going on. So when you look at this battle of North and South, by the way, Jesuits, they're big on South, the philosophy, education, science. And if we were to have time, I would go deeper. For example, Egyptian concept of God beyond Pharaoh, as much as Pharaoh says, I'm God, they still have a concept of transcended God above everything. And his name is nature. Do you hear an English word here? Nature?
Sure.
That we get from Latin, borrowed from, you know, it's a whole interesting thing. But Jesuits, strong on science, education, warfare, and mission.
Yes.
And so they go to conquer in the name of God.
So it almost seems like they become the intellectual missionaries
That's
spearheading the Roman Catholic response.
That's right.
Could this be the modern face of King of the North's evolution?
Notice that the conflict goes on. It's a constant struggle. Clement XIV expels Jesuits.
Oh, okay.
So 200 years later, and I'm just rounding numbers, Pope says, these guys are not listening to me. the Jesuit chief, they call him the Black Pope. None to do with the color.
color, right.
It's just one of those political terms, okay? They have their own rules, they don't obey, so let's expel them. And literally, Jesuits are expelled from every Catholic country. Okay? You could say it's a ploy, but notice what happens. Once that happens, terrible things happen. French Revolution, guillotine. And we could look at some verses that may infer to this, because those who invented guillotine were killed by guillotine. That's what's happening in France. It was more than chaos. It was terrible what was happening there. And so finally, it culminates in the arrest of Pope Pius VI. The year 1798, and I'm not getting in dates yet.
Yes.
We're building up. But Pope is arrested by French army. Okay, General Berthier, Napoleonic general, walks into Rome, arrests the Pope, and takes him away. Pope dies next year. And of course, the new Pope is installed, carrying the same name, Pius VII, and he makes the peace with Napoleon. They make concordat again. So you have a secular and religious power making peace
Again.
again. And as they make peace, of course, he's not so much in charge yet, all right? He needs to know his place. So Napoleon summons him to come to Paris to coronate him and Constance, his wife, as emperor and empress. And so Pope obeys. 3 years later, Napoleon would exile him, send him off. But then Napoleon gets in trouble, and we know the story, right? Napoleon loses Battle of Waterloo, gets again sent to Corsica and so on. And guess what? Pope comes back, and one of his first actions was to reestablish the order of Jesuits. So when you read the history of the church, and again, I'm not talking particular church, but in general, the main Christian church, it's a constant battle between the false spiritual ideas and the human secularist ideas that is ongoing. But I keep bringing that verse. Both are
Evil.
evil. So you cannot trust either or. Now, let me show you a few more examples, and I'm realizing that we may run over time tonight, but that's all right. Look at verses 38 and 39. In their place he shall honor God of fortresses, a God which his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign God, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. What's this foreign God business? And I'm wondering, could it be that at some point the church said, that's all right to worship in the shrines of other gods? Papacy has no issue with conducting masses in shrines of other pagan gods. And that is just a fact. That syncretic approach to faith, to me, is just abhorrent. I mean, you read Deuteronomy chapter 12, it specifically forbids any worship in a place where idols were set. And yet the church says, oh, that's all right. And that is carried on. So again, we could dig much deeper, and I promise we're going to do a recording in studio with prompts that I'm not just speaking from memory, but we would have some references and more things to show. But something else is happening. This is where, further on in that verse 39, look what it says. This king of the north will divide the land for gain. And I'm wondering, could it be that we're talking here doctrine of discovery? Dividing the land for gain. Where Pope Nicholas V gives Portuguese the permission to go and take the land as if nobody lives there.
Wow.
When Pope visited here in Canada in 2022, just 3 years ago, the big issue was rescind the doctrine of discovery. And it was funny for him to go on the record, and this is Vatican news. The doctrine of discovery was never Catholic. Time out, okay? This is the problem with chapter 11. Chapter 11 shows this constant seesaw, battle, okay? To say that it was two popes, Alexander Borgia, will do the same thing. He would advance through his orders even more the doctrine of discovery. And now to deny that it never happened? You see?
But we're looking now then, really, in this whole chapter, it seems the king of the north is the one who's most wanting to fight. Most initiative comes from them. He advances, deceives, plunders, and overthrows. Could this suggest that false religion has more aggressive role in the final conflict?
Yes. And it's interesting that at the beginning it was a south king that attacks, but then north dominates throughout all these verses. But then in verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. That's king of north. And so, remember, the Pope got arrested. Something is going to happen, and so this attack happens at the time of the end. Notice, again, time of the end is mentioned in Daniel 8 with little horn, Daniel 11, time of the end, and it will be mentioned again in chapter 12, which we study tomorrow. It's significant. And notice what's happening. This time, 19th century, church is under attack. This is a caricature from US Magazine, where you see all these churches are coming over to the state asking for handouts, and the state is saying, not interested in you. We're going to look deeper into this in Revelation chapter 17, because remember, from where we started, in Daniel 2, the statue did not have the 3 toes removed.
Sure.
But in Daniel 7, 3 horns are removed. So with every prophecy, there's new details. Once we get in the book of Revelation, Daniel 11 would be unpacked in very detailed way.
Excellent.
But we are still with Daniel,
Yes.
and Daniel has no clue, okay? He's watching this. And there is evolution. The South King is evolving from atheism to humanism. And so is the North King evolving. And so what I'm proposing today is new. I don't think many people heard this. I don't think theologians fully ruled out on this, but I'm going to go forward with this because to me it's interesting. The same time that Daniel is seeing all these visions, the same exact time, the 6th century BC, that Daniel is writing his book and sees these visions, something else is happening in the East. Out of Vedic Sanskrit religion, a false trinity, Trimurti, emerges 4 religions that are atheist. One of them is Buddhism. The next is Taoism, by the way, which suggests coexistence of good and evil forever and ever as balancing forces. Then comes Confucianism. And finally, there is another faith that is very interesting, okay? Notice the symbolism there. It's Jainism. It's the idea of superhuman, Aryan race. Do you see who's going to borrow it eventually? Okay. And so these religions are pure atheism. There is no God. You achieve your salvation through your efforts. If you just follow the right path, if you do the right things, if you do this magic, you could be a superhuman. And as I look at this, I know it's a bold statement. As God is revealing his plan, I believe Satan is preparing his grounds for counterattack.
That's what he said to Adam and Eve. You'll be like God.
Gets more interesting. There's a Jesuit, Matteo Ricci, goes to China. His church that he builds still stands as the most ancient Christian church in China. Venerated, protected, it's a part of legacy in China. But he reads Confucius, and he translates it in Latin, and he brings this philosophy and these ideas to the West. And now the Christian church is reading this, and these philosophers are swallowing it up. In the Catholic France and Catholic Italy and Catholic domain, you have René Descartes, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot. They are reading the pure atheism coming from China, and they are developing their own human reason philosophy. I wish we would have time to go there, okay? Because the idea of I think, therefore I am, okay, comes right there from René Descartes. It is influencing today a secular humanism. You are what you think. I may think you're confused, but you are what you think. You get the hint there, okay? Now look what's happening elsewhere. In Germany, under the same influence, they're developing human economy. From Immanuel Kant to George Hegel to Ludwig Feuerbach to finally Karl Marx. They're going to build paradise on earth by human effort. We don't need God. That's the message. And so in the East, with the Orthodoxy, you have their own upheaval to bring socialism and to bring finally the pure atheistic communism through Lenin. So notice what's happening. Marx writes his Das Kapital. Charles Lyell, he introduces idea of long, Earth was not created recently. There's millions, billions of years and all these fossils and all that. You see what's happening at the same time? The South is attacking the North. The religion is under attack by science and human philosophy.
Yes.
Nietzsche declares church, not just opium, but it's weakening the human race. If we just get rid of the church, we would become the super beings. And of course, I can't miss this dude, right?
Go ahead.
Darwin.
Yes.
Educated in a seminary, supposed to be pastor, loses his child, daughter, to the flu, cannot forgive God, stops coming to church, comes up with his solutions to troubles. What's funny, that as much as the woke people buy into Darwinist ideas, they ignore the fact that he was a racist. To him, Darwinism is about preservation of favored races.
Right.
Let's talk about that for a moment, you know. But the bottom line is this attack of South on the North. All three branches of Christianity, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, are under attack. You cannot deny that. In fact, what's happening in Europe, there are revolutions, and they're getting rid of kings. They're getting rid of church influence, and they're building a secular societies. Even in Italy, there's a new Risorgimento, where they're going to take away papal estates. See, when you look at the map of Italy, it was divided by papal estates. Pope rules from Rome. There's a southern Italy, and there's a northern duchies and little kingdoms. And so Italy says, no more of this. Pope, you're off your throne, okay? And we're going to build a united Italy. What's interesting, it's during this time, and I keep illustrating this because it's a constant battle.
Sure.
You see, it's during this time, Pope Pius IX, Pius, or different pronunciation, he declares Immaculate Conception. Notice how recent that is, okay? And he declares that Pope is infallible. Now, he himself gets in trouble, gets under house arrest, because when the state would take the papal states, he would rule the next 8 years out of his apartment in Vatican. And so, friends, this becomes a model of communist revolutions around the world. So you see how the battle is on. Russia, Soviet Union, that part of the world, they had time and again attacks against the church. So when I look at this chapter, I believe this is the ultimate king of the South.
Sure.
The fight of humanism and atheism and secularism against church, all right? Soviet Union is no more. Yes, there's Putin. But China has taken over. And it's from Mao, who declares the Soviet experiment failure, and he's going to do a better one. So you shouldn't be surprised when you see this alliance sitting together. Just a couple days ago at that parade in Moscow, you see? That's a real deal.
Sure.
I believe this is the South axis. You may feel a bit uncomfortable, I don't know, me putting you on such a political talk here.
Well, not really, because we're entering a very current global development. That's what we're seeing right now. But how do we avoid the speculation then, while being a part to alert about prophetic trends, thinking that this is exactly what is happening in our world affairs?
And that's what we're pointing out, trends. Not predicting, not prophesying, because we never know the future. We could look in the history and see how it happened in the past, church and state tensions. And we should watch out when we see those tensions happening today. Let's remember that the battle is not over.
Sure.
And the battle is not what we see, the battle is unseen. The great controversy between God and Satan. Notice the reaction to this South attack. We just unpacked the South attack, because the North will come against the South like a whirlwind in verse 40, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, and so on. And so, again, it's tempting to start looking at physical, material evidence, but let's think of spiritual attack. That church that was under house arrest, time goes by, a few decades go by, Lateran Treaty, year 1929, Mussolini gives the power back to the Pope. And that's the same Mussolini who stands there with Hitler. Just putting things in perspective. No one could question now the power of this particular Roman church and the influence of this church in the world. In fact, a few days ago, the whole world was watching for the white smoke. Now, I don't know if you even know who the Patriarch of Constantinople is. Do you know? I don't. Nobody cares. But this fellow, the whole world is watching. The tension is real. They have their own representative in the politics. United Nations has Vatican representation as official envoys. And so I believe that Daniel 11 is simply saying, look, there will be this unity and tension between church and state. It's something that is going to continue until the very end.
It seems like it's just an overarching thing to see both sides working together in this system to make their expression of what's important. And always it's going to seem to be in a rebellion against God. Not man's doing his own thing, secularism, what have you, but it's always going to be against God. That's the whole controversy.
That's right. As I'm putting this, I'm intentional about this bipolar situation in Daniel 11, because young generation, they believe that their voting will change the country. And yes, to a degree it may, but how much important is to be on the right side of God?
Yes.
That any of these political alliances. Because look at the tension that continues, all right? This is United States Embassy inside of Vatican, in Vatican. And they're flying a specific flag, okay, outside the building, 2021 US Embassy.
Wow.
Do you see tension there? Big tension. China. They have their own embassy to the Holy See, to the Vatican. So as much as we're talking tariffs, this and that, remember, verse 27, they sit at the same table, plotting their own things that we're not aware of, you see.
Wow.
Just think of these holy alliances of spiritual and secular. When you watch the meetings of the Pope with Gorbachev, the Pope with Fidel Castro, what's happening? We're recently witnesses, and I'm lingering here for a reason, because many people try to assign to a certain political leader spiritual authority. Let's remember, it's simply evolution of King of North. We're going to see that happening in Revelation chapter 13. That's why Revelation chapter 13 presents all these composite beasts from the past. So I believe that the North King is evolving, and we're going to see more of it because we're not there yet. Once we get to Revelation 13, we would see where we are specifically in history.
I guess people can then try and say, well, this is the first Pope that's American born. You know,
Right, and
that?
that's why I'm staying away from those speculations, okay? What is evident right now in the world, there's two alliances. And Daniel, imagine this, Daniel had no clue what tanks or missiles or drones are.
Right.
He saw in vision this phantasmagoric combination of the fight between two sides, between North and the South, throughout history unto the very end. What is evident right now in the world, there are two powerful alliances, BRICS and NATO. How will that evolve in the future? I don't know yet. We'll wait and see, but let's not be confused that neither of them is on God's side.
Okay. Although it may seem so because of the religious aspect dominating over the secular forces, but it's going to turn out very differently than we expected.
Now, verse 42 and 43 brings interesting point. Because North will stretch out his hand, and the land of Egypt, notice, now we're switching from south to a specific location. And there would be three more. There would be Edom, Ammon, Moab. There would be also others, Libya and Cush mentioned, Ethiopia and whatnot. Not getting in those details. We have few more nights to work out the book of Revelation. And that will explain Daniel 11. But the bottom line is, who is the dominant here? Just like in those previous verses, King of North takes all the initiative. At the end, it's the King of North who will dominate the King of the South. So here's my personal opinion.
Sure.
Even in this war, Ukraine versus Russia, the one who's on the side of the King of the North will win at the end. You get the hint.
I got you.
You get the point. You see, that's what's happening. And notice how it ends. Verse 44, news from the east and north shall trouble him. Now, that's interesting because he's the king of the north. Why should the news from the north trouble him? Biblically speaking, the east is the direction where Christ is coming from.
Sure.
We're to expect the king coming from the east.
Nice.
And the north, remember, the north is the true north. The true north, that's where God sits. The true up.
So it's interesting, that's what they call Canada, but anyway, that's another story.
Well, the land strong and free, right?
So
But, yeah.
we're looking at all of this. Does this align then with Revelation's prediction that all the world would wonder after this beast, this the king?
Makes you wonder. And we'll get there when we come to the book of Revelation there. Notice, he will go with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And so when we look at the end events, it is clear that he will attempt to destroy people of God again. But notice, he will come to his end and no one will help him. This king of the north will be brought to an end. Book of Revelation is very clear, thrown in the lake of fire. But we're going to wait until we get there that you would see what happens there. And notice, Daniel did not write chapters.
Okay.
These are our divisions. So chapter 12 is a continuation of this vision. And that's why it says, at that time, Michael shall stand up at the time of trouble, sorry, my misspelling, and at that time, your people shall be delivered. So what's the end story? I want to be people of God who would be delivered. I'm not interested in alliance with north or south. I want to stand with the people of God.
Amen. Amen.
We're ending here because ahead is chapter 12. And chapter 12 will introduce us to the book of Revelation. And it's beautiful because Revelation would not be written 6+ centuries later. There would be no prophetic revelations for almost 400 years until Jesus comes. But here in chapter 12 of Daniel, there is an introduction, a trailer to the book of Revelation to come. So friends, tomorrow night, we invite you, don't miss it. Tune in online and watch with us Daniel chapter 12. We ran over time tonight, but tomorrow it will be a bit shorter. God bless you.